Take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, sounds good. Well, yes, as Carly said, we are talking about sleep after a brain injury. And most of what I'm talking about today um, pertains to concussions because that's what I see the most of. But really, the mechanisms are the same regardless of how brain injury happened, right? So, whether we're talking about tumors or aneurysm or infections or alcohol or other chemical things, hypoxia, shockwaves, stroke, disease, surgery, so some iatrogenic stuff maybe, trauma, seizure, concussion, any of this stuff, the mechanism, the underlying mechanism of sleep problems is generally the same. And if you're here and you've been on any one of these before, either with me or someone else, you realize that no two brain injuries are alike, right? Regardless of if the injury was caused the same way as your best friend, or if your age is up there or lower. None of that really matters because a brain injury is going to kind of do what it wants to do, and the best we can do is deal with what's in front of us here. Okay, so why are we talking about it? We're talking about it because sleep disturbance is one of the major post-brain injury symptoms that I deal with in my office, and is very common. And we're talking about it now, um, largely because we had it scheduled for now. But I live in the Midwest. It's really dark, right? So we kind of have some confusion in our day-night cycles a little bit. I don't know about you, but I'm ready for bed at about 4 o'clock now. So before I even go in with my last patient of the day, I am usually ready for a nap, just because it's gotten dark. And I'm talking about it because I have been in working with brain injuries for about the last 10 years. I've been in healthcare. I actually did the math right before this because I was curious. I've been in healthcare for 18 years already, so we've been doing it quite a while. 10 in the at the doctorate level in the brain injury space, as a chiropractor at least. But yeah, so let's just get after it here. Okay. So, like I said, I'm Dr. Michael Hennis. I am a chiropractic physician. I am a functional neurologist and a brain injury specialist. So, yes, I'm a chiropractor by primary training. That means I went to chiropractic school and I learned how to do all the fun stuff there, which was a great segue into neurological rehab because our brain is basically a big computer and it uses information from our body to decide what's happening. So, if we have something like a brain injury that needs some rehabilitation, we have to figure out how to get that information into the brain. And physical medicine is a great avenue to do that. Beyond that, I have a diplomate in chiropractic neurology, or a diplomate in neurology from the American Chiropractic Neurology Board, which means I care way too much about brains and know a lot about rehabbing them. Everything from metabolic processes to nutritional influences to physical medicine and all the way through things like modalities. My job is to do anything I can to improve the way a brain functions, right? Whether that's exercise or diet or what have you. Okay. With that, sleep is a major component of that, right? There's no one that comes into my office that we don't at least touch on sleep. I talk about sleep usually the first 3, 4 visits. And with that, something else that all my patients get is breathing exercises. Virtually everybody that comes into my office, we have conversations around breathing and sleep. Guaranteed, those two things are going to happen, right? So beyond all of that, who am I really? I am a dad. I'm a husband. Last time we did one of these, she wasn't quite born yet. She's about 3 months old in this picture. She was actually 3 months old Saturday morning, um, and she actually just woke up here. I'm home today. Don't worry, my wife's out there now, so she's not crying by herself in the living room. This is about the best picture we could get of them. But yeah, this was Thanksgiving morning. So dad, husband, I'm a patient. I've had my own brain injuries, several pretty good concussions, actually. I'm a doctor and I'm an advocate, hence why I'm here and doing stuff like this. Um, but my business partner, Dr. Eric, same sort of thing. We understand the population because we are the population, right? So, like I said, this is Thanksgiving morning. This is about 10 seconds before. Neither one of them were very happy about it, so we told them they could take one more picture and be done. That works on the 3-year-old, not so much the 3-month old, but all good. Okay, So, what are we really after? We are talking about the brain, right? It's this little 3 to 4 pound gelatinous mass that floats around in some brain soup, if you want to call it, in your head, the CSF fluid, and it would actually crush itself under its own weight if you were to take it out and set it on the table. And it is highly, highly dependent on sleep in order to function properly. So, if the brain isn't functioning properly or we're not sleeping, what sorts of things are we going to find, right? Well, you're probably going to be irritable. You're going to be short tempered. You're going to be grouchy. Really, you're going to be a lot of fun to be around, right? I read a statistic out of a magazine. It was probably on Facebook or something like that that I saw it, but something like 75% of arguments that happen between a couple are because one of them is either hungry or needs a nap. So if you're starting to get a little testy with your significant other, ask yourself, have I eaten? Have I slept? Do I need to do one of those two things, or am I actually mad about what we're talking about? If not, maybe try and take a nap and or eat something and then come back to the conversation before you say something really mean. Okay. If you're tired, your brain feels like it's constantly loading, right? You know things, you're a smart individual, you've learned all sorts of different stuff, but you can't always pull that information out of your brain when you want it. So you feel like you're constantly on a delay, right? With sleep in particular, we can have issues falling asleep. So you're not able to fall asleep or you have trouble staying asleep. These are the two kind of entry level questions when it comes to sleep, right? So are you staring at the ceiling, counting the popcorn, or are you having no problems falling asleep, but then you wake up 2 or 3 hours later and suddenly that ceiling is the most interesting thing in the world, right? Those are the things we have to try and figure out on a entry level when we talk about sleep. Okay. And then, if that's the case, are you sleeping or napping all of the time because you are so exhausted, right? You're just tired all the time, right? Well, worst of all, you wake up and you're thinking, here we go again, because you don't feel rested at all. You've just slept 8 hours and you wake up and you're still exhausted, right? You don't feel like you've had any restorative sleep. Okay. So what do you really want? You want to be able to enjoy the people around you and have them enjoy your company. And that's what we're after. We're not in this to live life alone. We're in it to enjoy the people and the experiences around us. You want to be able to remember the things that you know, right? It's not called a comeback because you leave and come back. Terrible dad joke, but I have to use it. Brain injuries can do that to us, right? You know the answer to a question, it's on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't spit it out just yet, right? If you haven't slept, that happens a lot more often. Okay. You want to be able to fall asleep primarily, and then you want to be able to stay asleep, right? This is a little different for my wife and I right now. We are not sleeping through the night. It is not our fault. We have no problem falling asleep, let me tell you. Um, that's actually not fair. Blake sleeps through, she slept till about 5 o'clock this morning, so we're doing pretty good. Um, you want to wake up feeling rested, rejuvenated, without your brain feeling like mush and all your joints hurting, right? You want to be able to sleep through the night and feel rested when you do that. Most importantly, and what we're really after, right? Everybody wants to sleep, and if you have a little too much one day or not enough the next, what we're really after is having enough energy to be as active as you want and spend the time with the people that you want to that really matter, right? Whether that's your friends, your spouse, your significant other, your kids, your grandkids. If you don't have energy, none of those experiences are joyful and fulfilling, and that really kind of makes life a drag sometimes. Okay? So, what is sleep? Okay, we're going to nail out some of the nitty gritty before we figure out what sorts of things disturb sleep. And then we're going to talk about some high level things that you can do to improve your sleep, right? I can't get too specific on webinars like this. It just doesn't quite work that way. But we can talk about how sleep works. We can talk about what happens when it breaks down, and then what we miss, and then, like I said, some basic level stuff on what we can do about it. And I don't have anything to sell you. I've got my information at the end here if it makes sense to talk afterwards. Carly can always get you in touch with me as well if there's questions or anything like that. Okay. But what is sleep, right? Everybody knows what sleep is, but if you ever were asked to define it, it can be a little bit elusive. Okay. So sleep, you are not actually unconscious. It is a very, very conscious endeavor. If you look at functional MRIs, you look at EEGs, which map brain activity. There's a lot of things happening in the brain. So you are not as aware of them, but it is not an unconscious endeavor. If you are truly unconscious, we are talking coma, we are talking vegetative state, that sort of thing, okay? So sleep is actually a state of reduced mental and physical activity, okay? Consciousness is altered, but not absent, and sensory activity is inhibited to a certain extent, right? So for my ambulance days, we would look at something called the Glasgow Coma Scale. Is a person awake? Do they notice you when you walk in the room? Do you have to talk to them? Do you have to cause them physical pain by pinching the skin on the back of their hand or rubbing their sternum? Do they try and get away from those things, right? They can still sense these things even though they have altered consciousness, okay? Sleep is a little bit different. A lot of times, if you are a light sleeper, you hear everything in your house, right? I have very selective hearing, but while I'm laying in bed, I can hear a pin drop on the other side of my house and I am bolt awake, right? I don't, it doesn't take a whole lot to wake me up. Um, Conversely, there are some people that will only wake up if they hear their name. You can Everyone's seen internet jokes where people pile things on their friend on the couch and see how big the pile can get. Sometimes it takes a lot to wake people up. So it's this altered sense of consciousness where they don't necessarily feel, or more correctly, I guess, aren't alarmed by by the environment around them. Okay. What is the importance of sleep in a brain injury? And this is, I forgot to take my little thing out the corner. This is actually not from the American Psychiatry Association, so don't give them credit for that. I don't want them to get mad at me. There are two major components of neurological rehab that we have to consider, and sleep is a major component of these things. Okay. Most of you have probably heard the term plasticity before. This is the ability of our brain to learn new things, to change in response to our environment, whether that's things like neurological rehab or learning, going through an academic program, watching somebody do something so that you can then do it yourself, right? Most of this research comes out of, the original research came out of the learning or academic circles, and now we're starting to see a lot of it in stroke rehab or brain rehab in particular. So the ability to learn, form new neural connection in response to a novel stimuli, right? Something that's different. So if you're in my office and we find something that doesn't work, let's say you have poor visual skills, I'm going to give you exercises to make your eyes move better. Okay? We do that by activating individual parts of the brain that control our eye movements. We probably have to pull in some vestibular function. We probably have to look at your neck a little bit and how those muscles are working. But we have to combine those things together. And as we do that, we're forcing our neurons to make new connections. This is called plasticity. Okay, if we do this enough, those connections can then sustain themselves, right? This takes a minimum of 15 minutes. And in the long term, it takes about 3 months to make those changes permanent, right? And we can do some things to influence that time frame. But if you're not sleeping, we don't have the other side of that coin, right? There's two sides to every coin. First of them being plasticity. Can we make changes in real time in your brain? The second part happens when you're sleeping, specifically when you make it past REM sleep into stage 4 sleep. Okay, it is called stability. In this stage, our brain actually doesn't make new connections. It actually gets rid of the connections that we made during the day. Okay, a great example of this is short-term memory. You walk into your friend's house, you take your shoes off, you hang your jacket up, you put your keys down. Short term, you have to remember where you put those things, but when you wake up tomorrow, assuming you're not at your friend's house anymore, it's not going to matter. You don't need those connections, so your brain gets rid of them. Okay, that happens while you sleep. So we've all heard the adage, if you're studying for a test, do you stay up all night and cram, or do you call it quits at a reasonable time and go to bed? I know which one I preferred to do. I did not understand how this worked at that time. You are better off to go to bed because you are going to solidify those connections better. Whereas if you just do the cram all night and you never sleep on it, as soon as that test is over, that information is gone. Okay, so this is kind of like taking your short-term or working memory and turning it into longer-term memory. Okay, so in rehab, this is really important. We go through, do all the cool stuff in the office. We give you homework. Your job is to do that homework. Then we send you home, and then your job is to sleep so that that homework actually does something for you. Okay. So that's how sleep affects neurological rehabilitation. Sleep is also a consequence of our circadian rhythm, right? The circadian rhythm, from a chemical standpoint, is really the balance between cortisol and melatonin. There's also a light factor in this. So sunlight is a real deal. That's a little bit more complex and has to do with angle of the sun, getting light actually on your retinas as early as you can in the morning, and then keeping it off them at night, and a couple things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But really, if we look at hormones, this is a little bit easier to understand. We have two major hormones. Cortisol is a wake and stress hormone, and melatonin is kind of a rest and sleep hormone, right? Um, as we get later in the day, so this is morning, morning again, so this is a 24-hour cycle. This is about 9 o'clock if you don't read military time. As we start to approach bedtime, we'll just say 9 o'clock to be reasonable, 9, 10 o'clock, somewhere in that range, our melatonin starts to climb, right? This starts to slow our processes down. It makes us a little bit tired, makes it easier for us to fall asleep. This is the idea behind supplementing melatonin to go to sleep. Okay, that peaks about midnight and then starts to fall. As it starts to fall, we actually see cortisol starts to creep back up. Cortisol is a stress hormone. That is true, but it also has consequences in regulating our blood sugar. One of the reasons we wake up in the morning is because we haven't eaten all night long. Ideally, we've been fasting. Ideally, we've been fasting for at least 12 to 14 hours. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But our blood sugar starts to fall. And as that happens, our body starts to, I'm going to say, low-key panic, right? And its job then is to mobilize the sugar stores that we have in our body. And it does that through cortisol. So one of the reasons we actually wake up in the morning is because our blood sugar has gone low and our cortisol has then raised to mobilize our glycogen stores. So one of the things we talked about a moment ago is if you are having no trouble falling asleep, that probably means your melatonin is climbing appropriately. But if you wake up at the same time every night, 2, 3 in the morning, and you are just bolt upright, that cortisol has probably spiked prematurely. Okay, this could be one of two reasons. Either you're not managing your blood sugar levels appropriately as you sleep. This could be anything from full-blown type 2 diabetes to prediabetes or insulin resistance or even reactive hypoglycemia, right? I have a lot of patients that have no trouble sleeping or falling asleep, but on the weekend after they have a cocktail or something like that, they are bolt awake at 2, 3 in the morning after that cocktail because their blood sugar has gone up and down so quickly because of the alcohol. Okay, so one of the first things that we look at is trying to figure out where this cortisol melatonin cycle may have broken down. I'm actually not a huge fan of supplementing melatonin, at least in the long term. If you do it once in a while, it can be okay. But if you supplement long term, your brain actually gets lazy and quits converting into melatonin as well. This has effects on the dopamine system, and it has effects on the serotonin system. It has effects on all sorts of things. When you start messing with dopamine in particular, you can very easily become depressed. You can very easily lose motivation. And in severe cases, we can start to see some movement disorder types of things, right? We're really going down the rabbit hole very quickly. I'm not saying this is going to happen over the course of a week, but those are long-term effects. Okay. With sleep, we also have to consider the reticular activating system. This is a part of the brain stem. So get yourself oriented here. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. We've cut it in half from front to back, straight down your nose. And we're looking at cerebellum. This is the brain stem, pons, thalamus sitting right here, spinal cord down here. Okay. Primarily, we think of the reticular activating system as in the functional world, we have another name for it, the pontomedullary reticular activating system or reticular system. And it's a collection of nuclei that live in the pons and the medulla primarily. And the reticular nature of it means that it sends information all over the brain, but to nowhere in particular. Okay, so its job is to really wake the brain up, right? So this is what gets damaged in coma, vegetative state. We're not able to appropriately stimulate that system, one of the causes anyway. Okay, and because it goes all over the place, it really has this activating nature of the brain, and we can see some outward signs of this. Things like resting muscle tone, specifically one side of the body or the other. Autonomic function, again, primarily one side or the other is how we can go about measuring this. So this is more of a general brain function sort of thing rather than an individual thing that we can measure, right? So if I jump backwards, if we look at cortisol, we can measure cortisol, we can measure melatonin, we can do things like sleep studies to see how well you are sleeping, how well you're breathing while you sleep. Reticular activating system is a little bit harder to measure, so we have to draw some inference based on what we see bedside in the clinic. Okay. Then we have basal ganglia. I threw this in here because we'll see things like restless legs keeping people awake all the time. And if we treat restless legs, there's really two main causes of this. One is magnesium deficiency, pretty easy to figure out, simple blood test. If magnesium is low, we supplement to see if those restless legs go away. Okay, there's either a muscular component to that or a brain component to that. Magnesium is used all across the body, so that's kind of an easy thing to look at. Okay. In basal ganglia, when we consider these things, there's a couple different things we can look at. So first of all, what are they? Basal ganglia, or more correctly as basal nuclei, they're nuclei, they're not ganglia. That's because they are in the central nervous system, not in the peripheral nervous system. But we've talked about them this way for, well, a couple hundred years at this point, so I don't think we're gonna get that one correct. They are super deep in the brain. Okay, so if you look real close, this is actually optic nerve. This is your pituitary, cerebellum's right back here. This is your brainstem, at least the top of it. So they live right around the thalamus, actually. So they're very, very, very deep in the brain. Okay. Usually, we only think of the basal ganglia when someone says movement disorder, things like Parkinsonianism, or Parkinson's, or Huntington's, or dystonia, or tardive dyskinesia, right? These sorts of things. But they do a lot more than just modulate movement. Okay, they modulate all neurological activity. If it comes out of your brain, whether it's a thought, whether it's a sensation, whether it's a movement, it's going to be influenced by the basal ganglia, the things you control and the things you don't control. Breathing, digestion, all of this stuff is influenced by basal ganglia. Okay. Today, we're concerned with 2, maybe 3 of these loops. Okay, we have all these different loops that control them. So limbic would be the emotional side of things, cognitive, how you think about things, associative, your ability to draw a conclusion based on you felt a pain in your ankle. Was it because you stepped on a stick and it got you, or did a snake bite you or something like that, right? Your ability to associate sensations together. The ability to move your eyes around appropriately, and then the motor loop. Okay, so today we are concerned with cognitive. Can you slow your brain down enough to sleep, or do you constantly keep running through the events of your day or the things you have to do tomorrow? Best way to think about a cognitive loop that gets stuck or perseveration is getting a song stuck in your head. This is a terrible time of year for me. Yes, I sound like a Grinch. I hate Christmas music. It is everywhere and it gets stuck in your head and it just keeps going and going and going and going. That's a cognitive perseverative loop. Okay, that is all basal ganglia. Side note, the best thing to do if you get a song stuck in your head is actually pull it up on YouTube or something and listen to it start to finish. It gets stuck in your head probably because you only know the chorus and your brain really likes to finish things. So tidbit for the day, thank me later. Okay, we have limbic loops. Do you get yourself all worked up, anxious, depressed about things? And then motor loops. This is where the restless leg thing came in. As your brain starts to shut down for the night and we enter that altered sense of consciousness, are we getting a perseverative loop in our motor system causing us to move our legs? Okay, this can actually be magnesium based, even though it's a basal ganglionic problem, but we'll not split hairs at the moment. Okay, so how do we address all of these things, or how do we look at the ways these things break down, or other things that can influence sleep from a blood work aspect? Okay, some things we look at when it comes to blood work when our sleep is interrupted is, what's our thyroid doing? Okay, are we tired all the time where we have a hypothyroid situation? Are we unable to sleep for days on end where we are a little bit manic, where we're in a hyperthyroid situation? Do we flux between the two of them? So I've seen people with thyroid problems, particularly autoimmune thyroid, things like Hashimoto's in particular is the most common one in the United States. Literally 99% of thyroid cases in the United States are autoimmune Hashimoto's, autoimmune thyroid, Hashimoto's. And you can be diagnosed as bipolar with this sort of thing if it's not diagnosed properly. So it can be that drastic. We talked about blood sugar already. That blood sugar is way up and way down, and we're getting big spikes and valleys that can wake us up because of the cortisol cycle that we're going through. If you're anemic, you're going to have trouble delivering oxygen to different tissues of the body, and the brain is particularly sensitive to these things. When that happens, you would think your neurons would actually slow down, but initially, when a neuron gets weak or is missing a nutrient to work appropriately, it becomes very easy for that neuron to fire and do its job and become very activating. So we end up with this system in the brain where the brain is overfiring because it's starving for air. Okay. Starving for oxygen, maybe not air. You can be breathing fine, but if you're anemic, you're still not perfusing, meaning bringing that oxygen to your body appropriately. And this can be any number of flavors of anemia. Everyone's familiar with iron deficiency anemia. You're not eating enough red meat. You're not eating enough green leafy vegetables, molasses, any number of things that we can pull iron from. But there's also B vitamins. There's autoimmune anemia. There's chronic disease anemia. There's all sorts of things that can cause anemia. So don't jump straight to iron because it can have side effects. Okay. And then hormones, if our brain isn't working appropriately and our hormones are doing funny things, namely cortisol again. So we talked about cortisol with blood sugar, but all of our other hormones are actually built off of cortisol and cholesterol. So if our brain isn't working appropriately, we can't regulate cortisol, we can't regulate hormones, and that can give us some trouble sleeping. Okay. And then we have psychological issues that can cause issues sleeping. So depression, either you're tired all the time or you can't sleep. Depression usually has a flip side of anxiety with it, right? That doesn't mean you are bipolar. The two things generally just run together, okay? So loss of interest, changes in appetite, trouble sleeping, sleeping too much, loss of energy or increased fatigue. So whether you've slept or not, these things are happening, right? So, what sorts of things cause these symptoms? I assure you, it's probably not a deficiency of things like Celebrex or Ambien or medications or something like that. Although they can be great in the short term, we usually want to find the underlying cause. Inflammation of the brain is a major component of these things. The brain, unlike your ankle, doesn't have pain receptors in it. So if you roll your ankle and sprain it, it hurts. It puffs up, turns red. You store a bunch of fluid in it to try and brace that ankle. But more importantly, you get pain signals telling you that something's not right. The brain doesn't have that. So we end up with symptoms, right? And symptoms usually pertain to the body part affected. Well, the brain, because it's in charge of sensing everything in our body, really neurological inflammation can manifest as any symptom you could imagine. It can manifest as hallucination. It could manifest as insomnia. It could manifest as being tired all the time. We know in depression, there is always an inflammatory component of the brain. So we have to assess these things. Simple blood test can assess for inflammation. If you have high inflammatory markers, doesn't matter if it's from a stubbed toe, doesn't matter if it's from food sensitivity, it doesn't matter if it is from a brain injury. Those inflammatory markers are global, meaning they are going to get into the brain and have some influence on the brain, right? Again, whether you've stubbed your toe or had a brain injury, those inflammatory markers, cytokines, chemical messengers are traveling all over the place and they're going to have an effect on the brain. Real world, what does that mean? It means I've had patients come into my office and they call me up 2, 3 years later. Doc, my brain was feeling great. I decided to run a marathon and I sprained my ankle and I feel like I have a concussion again. I don't get it. I didn't hit my head. I didn't run into anything. I don't have any reason for my neurological symptoms to be back. Take it easy, rehab the ankle, call me in 2 weeks if it's still causing you problems. Because you have these inflammatory markers, the brain is going to suffer a little bit, okay? And we're always going to end up with symptoms, neurological symptoms in particular, in the weakest parts of our brain, okay? So inflammation is a major component of this that heavily influences our ability to sleep because of our brain function, okay? Brain fog is a great brain fog. The technical name for this is cognitive impairment. I like to think of it just like this guy here. You're walking around kind of removed from the world. You know it's out there, but you're not able to perceive it appropriately because of inflammation of the brain or just general decreased neurological function. Okay. These are the sorts of things that we start to see when the brain isn't working appropriately, right? I like to describe it as having your head in a fishbowl. Everything sounds a little muffled. Your voice sounds a little funny. You can see everything, but it's maybe a little bit blurry. You just feel a little bit removed from the world, right? The big astronaut helmet or cartoon fishbowl over your head or something like that. Okay. So when we don't sleep, our brain is a little bit like this fence here, right? It's there, it's standing, it's technically doing its job. Your brain is able to keep you going in the world. It's able to compensate to some degree. It's just not doing it very well, right? This fence is a fence. It's just not fencing very well, okay? Your brain doesn't brain very well when you're not sleeping, okay? So this is why we need to look at your health, your situation, your brain injury, but really your overall picture of health comprehensively, right? We can't just say you're not sleeping. Cool. Are you not falling asleep? Are you not staying asleep? Are you falling asleep and staying asleep, but you're not rested? Okay. You can take zolpidem, which is Ambien. You can take melatonin, magnesium, alcohol, codeine. All of these things will do a very good job knocking you out, but they're not necessarily going to provide you good restful sleep because there is a toll to be paid, right? Our liver has to process these things. We have metabolic components that we then have to break down that are further inflammatory. We're messing with our blood sugar. So we have to figure out what the root cause of these things are, right? And I'm not going to sit here and say we can always remedy these things 100%, right? That's not realistic. Especially in some severe brain injury cases, there are things that we just can't rehab anymore. But we can always make a positive impact and make a change and make that system as efficient as possible. Okay. And this is why we have to evaluate appropriately, right? We have to look at the entire system. We have to look at labs. We have to look at neurological function. We have to look at maybe some advanced testing. Maybe we have to actually do a sleep study. Are you breathing appropriately overnight? If you're not breathing while you're unconscious and not thinking about it, chances are you're not breathing appropriately during the day when you are awake and can think about it, okay? Like I said, everybody in my office gets a breathing exercise, okay? So if we don't look at a comprehensive picture of sleep issues, what do we miss? Well, it's pretty easy in the physical medicine space that I work in. It's pretty easy to miss depression and anxiety. Why? Because I don't have a scope in it. So I don't evaluate for it. But if you're not sleeping and you haven't been evaluated by a qualified mental health practitioner, I'm probably going to send you out for a referral for it, right? If they come back and say, nope, not the case, you're fine, great. Now we know we don't have to worry about it and we can rehab those sorts of things. Autoimmunity, namely, we talked about thyroid, but any number of autoimmune conditions can cause some issues because they're inflammatory. If the brain is inflamed, it doesn't function appropriately, right? Neurological degenerative disorders. If we are looking intently, we can find these things super early. What I'm talking mostly about here is dementia, Alzheimer's. If we find these things super early in the mild cognitive impairment stage, there's some really cool research that's not even so new anymore, saying that we can reverse these things with lifestyle changes. Okay. So we need to evaluate thoroughly in order to get a good picture of what's going on so that we can catch these things really before they become a problem. Okay. So now that we know all of this, what are we going to do about it, right? There's any number of directions we can go. And when you're presented with information like this, it can be very hard to make a decision. Well, where do I go first? What kind of provider do I see? My primary care provider doesn't really know where to send me, or I don't have services near me, right? All of these things are realistic, right? We've all heard horror stories of people getting bad care or getting really bad advice. In my world, in the concussion, I get 2 or 3 cases a week still. Go sit in a dark room for 2 weeks and wait for those symptoms to go away. And if I could bill for that, I'd be retired by now. Let's put it that way. So really, we have to figure out what we can do about it. And this is the wonderful thing about the internet is now virtual care can be had. At least consultations can be had relatively painlessly, right? So where do we go from here? Well, most people think if we do nothing that we're going to be in the same place tomorrow as we are today, right? That's kind of good logic. If we don't change anything, we don't rock the boat, nothing's going to change. But in reality, what we end up seeing is over time, our brain loses its ability to compensate, especially if we're not sleeping well. Okay, so we have to be able to sleep in order for our brain to recover, right? It's paramount to any neurological rehabilitation program, regardless of the level of that rehabilitation. Okay, maybe you went to an amusement park and you got a little dizzy riding the roller coaster because your brain can't handle that anymore and it's not going away. That rehab is going to look a lot different than a catastrophic watershed stroke, but we still have to get sleep as part of that rehabilitation program. Okay. So as our brain loses the ability to compensate, it's going to lose control of those compensation patterns, and those patterns are going to degrade as our brain just can't quite do it anymore. Conversely, coincidentally, actually, this actually makes you more and more tired. So one of the things that I see in my practices a lot is underlying vestibular issues that were habituated but not necessarily rehabbed, meaning somebody taught your brain how to deal with the sensations you were having, usually spinning or relationship to the world around you, but they didn't actually fix the problem. They just taught you how to deal with it. And then as those problems progress for a couple of years, your brain loses that ability to compensate, and those symptoms start to come back, and they're usually a little bit worse, and your habituation exercises just don't quite work anymore. So that's usually if we do nothing. If we decide to go get some help, so we go to a provider that manages concussion symptoms or manages brain injury symptoms, get some help. We're probably going to have some ups and some downs, but eventually we maybe aren't quite to the point that we want. Or we can get to the root cause, figure out what's happening. When it comes to sleep, we really have to figure out why aren't we sleeping, right? Are we apneic? Are we anemic? Is our blood sugar having problems? Do we have underlying inflammation? Is there some, we'll say, a couple of cross wires in our brain where we're not communicating properly between the different parts of our brain? Once we figure that out and we can approach that rehab appropriately, right? Sometimes it's simple. Sometimes it's an iron supplement. Sometimes it's magnesium. Sometimes it's intense neurological rehabilitation. Sometimes it's getting a mouth guard or an appliance like a CPAP for sleeping, right? Sometimes it is a little bit more involved. Sometimes it's simple. But we have to figure out what that root cause is if we're going to make any real progress in rehabilitation, right? I say that a lot. So if you're getting sick of it, it's coming a couple more times. Don't worry. So TBI recovery is all about three things. Okay. If we get down to brass tacks, make it really simple, it's about three things. Okay. Oxygen, I think we've covered that a little bit between the anemia and the sleep apnea. We have to have a good oxygen supply to our cells for them to work appropriately, particularly in the brain, particularly in the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. Okay. Oxygen is huge. Just because you're breathing appropriately, again, if you're not delivering that oxygen, you're not perfusing appropriately, delivering that oxygen to the tissues, it doesn't really matter how well you're breathing. Okay. Activation and plasticity. So are you able to have good plasticity? And I should actually modify this slide to have stability on there because that's essential, having good sleep to turn plastic change into stable change in the brain. And are you getting good activation? Or do you have some strange compensation pattern that you were either taught or came up with on your own, helping you get through the day that's actually making the problem worse because we're just ingraining these bad patterns? Okay. And then finally, fuel. Fuel is kind of a catch-all category. Uh, Depending on what I'm talking about, I talk about food, I talk about metabolic changes, I talk about sleep, I talk about environment, I talk about all of this falls under fuel. The general gist of it is if you were to go out on a road trip, do you put gas in your car after you've left, or do you want to start with a full tank, right? You're not going to get very far if there's no gas in your tank. So we have to have good fuel. We have to have good building blocks for the nervous system to reorganize itself before we start. Okay. So this could be relationships. Do you have toxic relationships that you need to get rid of because they're causing you stress? Do you have good nutrition? Do you have good blood sugar delivery? Do you have some kind of environmental toxin that's holding you back, mold, Lyme, chronic disease, right? Um, Long COVID is a real thing, right? We're seeing a lot of this lately and really keeping um, brain injury survivors stuck. But also, I think we're seeing a lot of long COVID misdiagnosed as post-concussion syndrome, and post-concussion syndrome being misdiagnosed as long COVID, right? I don't want to dwell on this because I'm not an expert on long COVID, but I've been reading a couple of papers about that lately too. Okay. So we kind of already covered this, all right? But really, with most things, it's we have to activate the brain. We can't do it too much or we overload the brain. If we don't activate the brain enough, we're not going to cause enough stress on the brain for it to change itself. But we also want the brain to have predictable reactions to the things that we give it. Okay. Fuel. If we sum this up as food, we need to eat good food. It's got to be real food. We can't eat too much because that does funny things to our blood sugar. And it should actually be mostly plants. Okay. Again, don't want to dwell on this. This isn't a nutrition seminar, right? And once we do those three things, we've really hit the three components that we need to have good neurological rehabilitation. Just working on these three things on your own, namely this fuel and oxygen delivery, can do a lot in improving your neurological health, right? If I can't get someone in the office for rehab, this is where we spend a majority of our time because it's the easiest thing to nail down. Okay. So now that we know all these things, what does this look like? Well, it involves good testing. We have to figure out what parts of the brain we are looking at, which parts are working, which parts aren't working, and how they relate to each other, and then what we're going to do about it. Okay. We can do things like neurological rehabilitation. Okay. Breathing and meditation. Like I said, everybody that comes into my office gets a breathing exercise. We are Americans. We don't like the word meditation, but surprise if you are doing your breathing exercise really well, that is actually meditative. And that is huge. If you have a good daily meditative practice for as little as 5 minutes a day, over the course of 8 weeks, you can see thickening of the neocortex, the outer layer of your brain, on an MRI in 8 weeks. In order to see a change on MRI, you have to have a 50% change in density. So a meditative practice, meaning breathing exercise essentially, you can promote neurological connection in the brain for free in as little as 8 weeks. Okay, that's crazy. If you're not good at that sort of thing, if breathing exercises are just too boring for you, this is I have no affiliation to this. On Netflix, search the word Headspace. Headspace is actually an app, but the guy that invented the app is or was a Buddhist monk. I'm not totally sure, but he basically walks you through the science of meditation, and each episode has a little meditation to it. They're pretty short and pretty easy to do. So I've been giving that to my patients quite a bit. You have to have a Netflix account and some quiet space, but if you're going to sit and watch TV anyway, that's a good way to do it. Okay. Laser therapy, we do lots of laser in our office. Vision therapy, coordination, strength, movement, balance training, all of these things are different windows into rehabbing different parts of the brain. Okay. And I can't emphasize enough good blood labs, right? Blood labs are a great way to look under the hood. I realize this is a brain injury network seminar, but we can't separate the brain from the rest of our body. So looking at our metabolic health is huge in understanding our brain health, okay? I realize I said earlier I don't look at hormones a whole lot, and I realize it's a little counterintuitive that I would then have a hormone slide in here, but it's about the best blood lab slide I could find because there's no needles on it. People don't like looking at pictures of needles. But bang for your buck, a good comprehensive blood panel, not the one that gets run at your yearly physical, is the cheapest, most comprehensive way to look at what's going on in your physiology and the easiest window to figure out things that you can improve short term. The drawbacks of a blood panel, it is a snapshot in time. If I ran your labs 3 days in a row, I'm probably going to get 3 different values for a lot of things, especially things like iron and blood sugar and even lipids and cholesterol. They're going to fluctuate a little bit, but we have to based on the information that we have. I like to run labs on patients about twice a year, once a year at minimum. Um, but like I said, these panels need to be comprehensive. When I run a lab panel on someone, I'm not running anything crazy, but I still run 86 markers, right? So it's a lot. When we're looking at things like a thyroid, I need to see more than your TSH. I need to see a TSH. I need to see a T4, T3, T3, free T4, T3 uptake, reverse T3, thyroid antibodies. I want to see what's going on in that thyroid. I want to see the entire process of thyroid hormone creation and metabolism and use. Right? If we can't see that, we don't really know what's happening. Okay. And then once we have all the information, we're going to decide where the best place to do some work is, right? And I encourage you to do some of this stuff. So if you're having trouble sleeping, get a good blood panel. If you are feeling super tired in the morning, get a sleep study done. If your legs are moving all over the place, measure your iron status, measure your magnesium, see what's going on, right? Ask some questions. If everybody says everything's fine, well, ask more questions of more people because you're still having problems, right? Don't settle for the doctor you've been seeing for years telling you that everything is fine, right? I'm not picking on anybody's doctor because I'm guilty of getting comfortable with my patients too and missing things, right? That's the beauty of having business partners is I can very easily say, hey, go see my doctor friend over here and we'll get a second set of eyes on something like this, okay? So what I can leave you with today is a nice piece of meditation. I really like Headspace. There are any number of great apps that are great for improving brain health. And I think I gave you a few tools that you can look at. Again, nothing's terribly specific because we're on a webinar and I don't know your full history of what's going on. But I think I gave you some good questions to ask. So I'm going to leave you with that. And that's my information. If it makes sense, you can email me or you can find me at theneuralconnection.com. We have a contact us page. Otherwise, that's the clinic email. We have a fair number of patients from North Dakota that do come to see us. Otherwise, I have some providers that I know in the area from a medical standpoint that do some virtual appointments across the state as well. And Carly, I don't know if there's questions anywhere. I wasn't paying
Yeah,
attention.
I had one that came in through via email, someone that couldn't make it that wanted to know what your recommendation is for rest and naps during the day after brain injury.
Sure.
General recommendations for the length of a nap in the day or a formula to help guide an individual in creating a sleep rest routine.
Sure.
Takes all those things into account.
Napping is really kind of controversial in brain injury. I'm of the camp that says if you need to sleep and you need to rest, right? I think telling people to rest after a brain injury gets really bad connotation. What we're talking about is complete rest. Okay? After a brain injury, I don't want you sitting in a dark room, wearing headphones, ignoring the world, right? That is not what we're after. That doesn't mean you shouldn't rest though, right? If you work a high stress job, if you work a loud job, if you are easily overstimulated, you still need to remove yourself from those situations. That is still resting, right? If you can only work 2 hours a day, if you can only be around people for a certain amount of time, if you need to take a nap, those things are okay. Okay, so don't misinterpret complete rest with not resting at all. So if you're tired, by all means, take a nap. If you are napping and you're not sleeping at night, that is a different story. Now we have to worry about sleep hygiene. Something I didn't talk about today is sleep hygiene, and people that have kids are going to understand this a little bit better or around kids a lot. Kids do really well with schedules. When you mess with the kid's schedule, you need to be prepared for World War III. It's just kind of the way it goes. Sleep and bedtime routines work really well in children, but joke's on you, they actually work better in adults. Okay, so most of us have really bad sleep routines. What do? We come home, we eat dinner, we're probably in a hurry, we maybe catch up on some work, and then we watch TV for 3 hours. Then we get in bed and we scroll on our phones, and we only get 6 hours of sleep anyway, right? So we just don't have good sleep hygiene. Whereas if you can put yourself on a good schedule, if you are able to read a book, turn the lights down dim, use a lamp light so it's not up overhead. These things do great things for normalizing that cortisol, melatonin, circadian rhythm. Okay, getting into a process, so turning the lights low at 7 so you don't have overhead lights, And then maybe you shower, maybe you change into pajamas, you isolate yourself in a quieter space. So again, you're getting this process for getting yourself to bed. So you're priming your brain to know it's time to sleep, right? This works really well. Give it about a week. Don't think it's going to work in one night because you're just going to be annoyed that you changed your routine. But you're going to need a little bit of time for this. Okay. So sleep hygiene is a big one. If you are sleeping just fine at night and you're still tired, now we have to look at things like sleep apnea. We have to look at anemia. We have to look at really metabolic things if you're not sleeping, not rested when you wake up. If all of those things are still good and you are still tired, you are still easily overwhelmed, in my practice, my first assumption, if you are being made tired through, I'm going to say minimal stimulation, right? You're awake for 2 hours and you have to take a nap. There's probably either a vision component and or a vestibular component to those things. Your brain, virtually every part of your brain correlates to vision in some way, shape, or form, whether it be association or pointing your eyes in the right direction so that you don't get hit by a bus or eaten by a tiger or something like that. Okay. If your brain can't move your eyes appropriately, it doesn't know where they are, it can't relate to your other senses, it's going to make you freaking exhausted because you are just trying to see what's happening in the world around you. If your eyes aren't a problem, but you have underlying vestibular things, maybe you're not dizzy, but you don't actually know where your head is on top of your neck. Again, your brain needs to know where you are. These things are exhausting, right? It's very, very hard to go interact with the world when you don't know where you are. So these things can make you very, very tired as well. So again, we still have to figure out why you feel the need to nap, why you feel the need to sleep. But if you have to do that to function, then by all means do it. But don't just settle for saying, well, I need to take 2 naps a day. I need to nap for 4 hours in the middle of the day to get through it, right? I don't have any real recommendations for how long or what the best time of day is or any of those things. But make sure we're not overusing stimulants. Make sure we're not using sedatives. Make sure our metabolism is intact. Um, Anecdotally, I seem to remember reading something that if you elevate the legs while you sleep, it actually makes it easier to get blood flow to your brain and can make a shorter nap more restful because you're better perfusing the brain. I don't know how valid that is, but I've given it to a couple patients and they seem to think it's effective. Also, there's some great YouTube video about non-sleep deep rest that might be useful as well. That's Dr. Andrew Huberman. That his podcasts are really intense and long, so they can be kind of difficult to listen to. But non-sleep deep rest, NSDR, he calls it, and he's got a couple of different. They're basically guided meditations that can be very helpful as well. So something else that you can look at for free that should help those things out. Okay, so if you feel like you need to nap but you can't, pull that up on YouTube, on a phone or a computer or smart TV or whatever. Close your eyes and work your way through that as well, and it can be very very restorative as well. Okay, I hope I answered that question. I realize it was about as not straight of an answer as I could
No,
give,
I think that was perfect.
but I don't have a straight answer for that.
Nope, that's perfect. There's one more in the chat. Can you speak about menopause and varying estrogen levels affecting sleep?
Yeah, so what we really have to worry about there is, are we metabolizing our hormones appropriately? So are really tough to say. Did we use a lot of birth control through our life? Are we on hormone replacement therapy? Do we have adequate brain function to stimulate our pituitary appropriately? Is our liver function doing well enough to move those hormones and break them down appropriately? Do we have things like MTHFR mutations where we can't methylate properly, meaning we can't break those hormones down? So estrogen menopause in general is tough because levels are variable on a day-to-day basis, right? We can have really good weeks dealing with it. We can have not so good weeks dealing with it. I will be totally honest, hormones are not my favorite thing. So I tend to, we'll say, ignore them in my learning. I don't ignore them in my patients. I do what I can, and if I'm not making progress real fast, what I do is I end up referring out a lot sooner when I think hormones are a primary issue. But the biggest thing I find is dealing with the ability to break hormones down. which is a liver function. The ability to detox things is kind of a major component to that. So if we're really, really struggling with hormone metabolism, getting a good blood panel again, making sure we're looking at things like B vitamin status, looking at liver function. Um, I think I use Vibrant Labs. I can run a MTHFR test. It's not very expensive at all. Um, I should probably just add it to my regular panel, but I don't order it on everybody unless we've got symptoms for it. Okay. Any reason I keep waking up every hour to about 4:30? Without more information, I really can't answer that. I don't know. My suspicion is either a cortisol thing or a perseveration thing, but I don't know. Sorry, Skip.
There's one right above that too. Do you have any thoughts on sleep disturbances in relation to individuals with multiple diagnoses, like intractable epilepsy, autism, developmental delays?
Well, right off the bat, we said multiple diagnosis, not multiple sclerosis. I read multiple sclerosis. Uh, intractable epilepsy, autism, developmental delays. So the autism, developmental delays for sure go together. The epilepsy, my first thing that runs to my head at that point is inflammation. Um, I don't do ketogenic diet a lot. If you have not tried a ketogenic diet in as a I'm going to say intervention, not necessarily a treatment for the epilepsy, I would strongly suggest going strictly keto for a while and give that a try. Um, that would be the first thing. But my initial thought on that is inflammation, just keeping the brain from working as well as it can.
Great. Thank you. We always appreciate your time. Amy, do you want to talk? She raised her hand.
I'd love to. Thank you so much, Dr. Hannes. And is that how you pronounce it?
It is, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm the one that asked the
Yeah.
estrogen and the epilepsy question. I have a son who's 14 years old, and does tend to wake up. So it's multiple causes of sleep issues on both of our ends, but my husband and I, and then my child. But we have been giving him melatonin in addition to his other anti-seizure medications. He is a very bread loving individual. We've tried to do a low carb keto type diet, but it's just not totally doable according to his behaviors and interests and things like that. Cognitively, he's probably 3-ish years old. But I appreciate your input on that, and we'll continue to try that. But do you have any further comments up on melatonin usage? So we cut back on that. We don't give them a huge amount, but we give them maybe 3 to 5 milligram tablets most nights.
That's enough. I mean, melatonin's funny because at the time I was in chiropractic school, a large dose of melatonin was 3 milligram. I'm sorry, I don't even know the units in which you give melatonin anymore because I don't give it. I think 3 milligrams, and now that's about entry level, right? I mean, you can walk into a GNC and pick up 12 milligram capsules, which blows my mind. In the US, melatonin is over the country. In other countries, it is not. So don't underestimate the power of a melatonin supplement. I am not a fan of long-term, again, because your brain can become dependent on it and its ability to make it. And also dopamine, there's consequences in the dopamine system. So again, in your son, where he's at the level of a 3-year-old, this might be a little bit harder. Obviously, because drive and reward systems and stuff like that aren't going to be functioning appropriately anyway. In an adult, usually we look at things like depression, or are you satisfied with the work you're doing, not just the result of what you're doing? And melatonin can start to modulate that sort of thing. A couple of other things that you can look at is magnesium. Magnesium is a lot, has much has fewer side effects, especially like magnesium threonate, where it's going to specifically get into the brain. And help slow things down. Inositol, apigenin. You can do some reading on those sorts of things. Fewer side effects with those things. Also, just rotating what you're using, so you're not using melatonin every single night, right? Um, Rotating supplements can do sorts of things like that. You had mentioned removing bread and those sorts of things. If you haven't tried doing that with digestive enzymes, specifically DPP4 enzymes that work to break down gluten systems, gluten is a very sticky protein. I'm assuming that's why we're trying to remove the bread, is both the carbs and the gluten aspects, especially with autism. That can be huge. But gluten's really sticky. Think of it like getting gum in your carpet or in your hair. It's really tough to get it out without cutting it out. So what do? You freeze it and you scrape it out harder. Well, digestive enzymes do that sort of thing. So it'll help you remove that from the system faster. Otherwise, you're looking at months to get that out on its own. So one of the things we talk about in our office when we do dietary work with people and we're removing things like inflammatory proteins, gluten, casein, whey, dairy products, essentially, is if you haven't done this for at least 30 days, you haven't given it a real try because these proteins are sticky and it's really hard to get rid of them. We speed that along with digestive enzymes because if you're not used to it, it's tough. If you have a 14-year-old with any kind of bodily development with the self-control of a 3-year-old, that is going to be very tough. And I commend you for that.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I really appreciate this whole topic on multiple levels. So we used to live down in the cities, but now we're in northern Minnesota. But I think we'll be visiting your clinic now eventually.
Well, give us a call.
All right. Thanks, Mike, Dr. Michael.
Very welcome. You can call me Mike. That's fine.
Thanks, Amy. All right. Anybody else? Any last questions before we let him get back to that little baby sweet girl? I could hear her.
She's back there a little bit. She's probably about ready to go back to sleep.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. We always appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Okay. We'll talk soon. Bye.